I'm so excited. Our next presenter is Mariana Byndloss, and she is a faculty member here at Vanderbilt. Someone that I've just been so excited to get to come speak to the VSSA. This year it's virtual, which means more people get to see her. What a wonderful opportunity. So thank you so much, Mariana, for being here. We're excited to hear your story.
No problem. Thanks, Beth, for inviting me. Let me figure it out. Sharing the screen as usual. Can you guys see it?
Yeah, looks perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth, for inviting me to speak. I am Mariana Byndloss. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the Department of Pathology, Microbiology, and Immunology. And so I'm going to talk today, you guys, a little bit about my journey and about some of the work that we do in our lab. So I'll try to keep half and half. And every time someone asks me to talk about my journey to people, this is the first sentence that comes up to my mind. And if you guys notice, this is not in English, this is in Portuguese. And you're gonna realize quickly that I'm not American. I was born in Brazil. And this sentence is actually a Brazilian music that I really like it. And if you translate, it says, "You have no idea how much I have walked to get where I'm at." And the song goes on and does more. I can even send you guys the link. But it's a song that I think a lot about it, because I think a lot of times we see people's successes and how far they've come, but sometimes we forget at what it takes to get to where people are. So that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my story. So as I said, I was born in Brazil. I was born in a small city between Belo Horizonte and Rio that called Juiz de Fora, but I spent most of my life in the city called Belo Horizonte, which is the capital of this Minas Gerais state. And I wanted to say, like, who inspired me, or the people that made me who I am, are my family. So I come from a family of 3 sisters. My dad was actually a businessman in Brazil, so he ran a business company, so not a scientist at all. And my mom here, she actually quit school, working to take care of the 3 of us. So she used to be a teacher, so educator, but gave up or stopped working to take care of us. And another person that is really important in my life, and I guess it has inspired me a lot, is my grandmother here. She was actually given away when she was 8 years old by her mom, and she was adopted by a different family, and she actually never made it out of what would be elementary school in the US. And she always tells me that she always wanted to study more, that she really liked school, but she couldn't do it because the life that she's had. So every time I think about something difficult in my life, I think about her and all the opportunities that she actually never had in life. So one of the first questions is, when did I fall in love with science? And that is a very difficult question for me, because I don't really have a moment. But what I do know is that, so I went to school actually in a Catholic school in Brazil, a private school. And I learned early on that I loved biology and chemistry. Genetics for me was like super interesting. And so I think that I always knew that I wanted to do something related to biology. And I was considered one of the smartest students in class. And in Brazil, if you think about someone that is smart, the first thing that people say is like, "Oh, you should go to medical school," right? That's the obvious. You should be a doctor. But I had a problem. My biggest problem is that being young, I actually did not want to deal, with dead people. Like, the thought of doing necropsies and working with dead people was kind of not appealing to me. And I actually really liked animals too. So I was actually talking to my sister here. Her name is Sylvia at the time. She was going through vet school at the time. She was my middle sister. And we were talking, and I was like, I think I'm just going to do a biology degree because I really like biology. I really like animals. I really like, and she's like, "You know what? I have a better idea. You should go to vet school." In Brazil, you go straight from high school to university, so you don't do college. So when you apply to university, you have to decide your degree right then. So after talking to her, she's like, you should go to vet school because you learn a lot about the biology you will learn. But if everything else fails in your life, you don't just want to do science, at least you're going to have a clinical degree. And at least you're going to have that to hold on to. I was like, yeah, sounds like a good idea, right? Your older sister, she seems smart. So I ended up going to vet school in Brazil straight from high school. And that's when my life kind of started to change, because I knew I liked research and I wanted to have the research experience. And that's when I met this person. His name is Renato de Lima Santos. He's a professor in Brazil. And I tell everyone that without him, I would have not been where I'm at. Like, he was my first mentor. And I did what we call scientific initiation. In Brazil, there's a program called scientific initiation. So while you're in vet school, you can do research at someone's lab, and you got paid like the equivalent like $20 a month. And I ended up working in his lab, and he's a pathologist, a veterinary pathologist that works with infectious disease. And he was really a person that changed my mind about science. He was a really hard worker, and he would challenge me all the time. So he encouraged me to write my first manuscript. So because of him, I have a first author manuscript from my undergrad. And he actually gave me the manuscripts to write, which was a very interesting experience. I decided to do masters with him. So in Brazil, you usually do masters before a PhD. So I stayed with him and did masters. And that's when he started to help me establish collaborations with people overseas, gave me the chance to mentor students, and start to really mold me as an independent scientist. And then I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, because at that time I was like, I think I really want to stay in science and be a professor. That's what I wanted to do. And that's when something interesting happened. He came to me and he's like, you must do your PhD overseas. He's like, you're one of my best students. I could just take you here. You could stay in Brazil and continue to do science in Brazil. But I think that you really, if you want to be the scientist that you want to be, I must let you go, and I must encourage you to do your PhD overseas, which is really, and he was the one that opened the doors to collaborators in the US. So with his help, and what is funny here is that I actually applied for fellowships to the Brazilian government so I could get funded to do my whole PhD in the US. And I actually got into the PhD program in US, but the Brazilian government denied my fellowship. They said I didn't have enough publications, I wasn't good enough, so I didn't get the funding. And that kind of delayed my plans a little bit. And I had to figure out a different way. And that's when I took this first big move, which was from that town in Brazil where I was doing my PhD to a city called Davis, California, to do my PhD. And the reason why I did that is because this woman, Renee Solis, who is my co-PhD advisor, she took a chance on me. And she said, well, I have enough funding for 2 years. You can come to the US to do part of your PhD here, do part of your research here. And I'll fund you for 2 years. And I was like, okay, so I'm gonna go to the US for 2 years, do my research in her lab for 2 years, and then I'll go back to Brazil. But that never happened, right? Obviously, I'm still here. She ended up getting more funding, things worked out. So I ended up doing all my research, my PhD research with her. And then at that point, I was like, I want to stay in the US. Research here is much better than Brazil, so I have to figure something out. So I decided to do a postdoc. At that time, I had kind of gave up on the idea of doing residency for vet school. I pretty much didn't do any veterinary work. So I decided to do postdoc. And that's when I stayed in Davis and did my postdoc with Andreas Baumler, who is an infection, he works with salmonella infection, and I'll tell you a little bit about later. But if you notice here, you notice that I stayed in the same institution for my postdoc. And that is usually an advice that against what everyone says, right? Everyone says in science, you should move to different places. And one of the reasons why I stayed is obviously because I really admired Andreas. He's actually Renee's husband. So he was in the lab next door, so I knew him, and I really liked his research. So I pretty much just went into his office and say, hey, Andreas, can I be your postdoc? And he's like, sure. So I never actually had a bunch of postdoc interviews. But a big reason why I decided to stay in California is because of my family. So at that time, I had met who's already my husband now for a few years, and and I ended up finding out I was pregnant around that time. And his family lives in California. So we figured for our family, staying in California was the best decision at the time. And I do have my son here too, but now he's 7 years old, so he grew up. So I tell you this story in a very short way, and if anyone has more questions, you're welcome to ask me later. Because my path was not the most common one, right? And I had to make a decision that most people would think that was counterproductive to your success because of my family or because of what I wanted. But what I wanted to point out to you guys is that although I had a child, although I stayed in the same institution, I ended up publishing 2 big high impact papers for my postdoc. So I continued to be able to work. I continued to be able to do the science the way that I wanted. And everything actually worked out because in 2018, I ended up getting a faculty position here at Vanderbilt, where I have been for the past 3 years. So there's definitely multiple ways to be a scientist and to get where you want to be. And I have way more stories that I don't have time to tell here, but if anyone wants to talk to me more, I'm more than happy to talk to you guys. So what I wanted to finish that part is with some quotes that actually helped me move on, and realize that I am different. My path has been different, but I got to where I wanted to be. One of them is really stay positive, continue to work hard, trust in yourself. You can make it happen, even though your path may be different than others. And the truth is there are no shortcuts to this. It's a hard career. It's a long time. It's going to take a while, but you can get to where you want to be. And the third one is be the change you wish to see in the world. Like, you can do science, and by being a scientist, you have the power to change the society and to make the world a better place. So that's the thing, what I usually think about as I continue my path now as a professor here at Vanderbilt. So this is like my life story, and I wanted to spend the next 10 minutes before questions telling you a little bit about what we do. So when I was in Andreas's lab as a postdoc, I became very much interested in the relationship between microbes, especially the ones that live in our gut, with the host and how that can affect disease. So our lab here at Vanderbilt is following up on those, my postdoctoral work, and we're really interested in this relationship between the host and the microbes that live in your intestine, the microbiota, how they work together to prevent disease, and what happens when this beneficial relationship becomes affected, and how that may lead to human disease. So when we're talking about the gut microbiota, it's a very complex ecosystem, but one of the things that I wanted to point out to you all is that most of those microbes don't like oxygen, so they're obligate anaerobes. And they have very important roles. One of them is to help us with nutrition. So what they do, they break down fiber into these molecules called short-chain fatty acids that actually promote a lot of our health. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. But one thing that happens sometimes when there's a disruption in this gut microbiota, and that can happen if you take antibiotics, if you change your diet, if there's an infection, we see it change in this community. So we start to see this bloom of obligates to what we call facultative anaerobic bacteria. And these bacteria are very different than the healthy ones, what we call them mostly Enterobacteriaceae. They're different because they can grow in the presence of oxygen, so they like oxygen. They don't really digest components of your diet that help your health, such as fiber. And some of them are detrimental bacteria or pathogens, such as Salmonella typhimurium, that is such agent of diarrhea, and some strains of E. coli that you hear all the time about E. coli outbreaks, right? So those are the bacteria that we work with. That you can, like, if you can eat a dirty lettuce or some food. So what is interesting here is that this change in the microbiota, this expansion that we call this bad microbes, happens in a lot of human diseases, such as necrotizing enterocolitis in kids, such as inflammatory bowel disease, in cancer, metabolic syndrome, and the list goes on. So we think it's happening here is that this expansion of this particular microbes are microbial signature that there's something wrong with the microbiota. And in my postdoc, what we found, we decided to use a model treating mice with antibiotics to see how, if we could explain why this dysbiosis is happening. So we treat them with the antibiotic called streptomycin, and what you can see here is that E. coli expands a lot in the gut. So it's a good model to understand what's happening. So I didn't want to show you guys a lot of data, so I wanted to just kind of have summarize what we found. So pretty much what we found, and that was a lot of work. So I'm summarizing here like 3-4 years of work in one slide to see how hard science is and how long it takes. So what we found out here is that this beneficial microbes produce metabolites that activate specific pathways in the epithelial, so in the intestinal cells in your gut, that those pathways decrease inflammation and make the intestinal epithelial cells consume a lot of oxygen, creating an environment in your gut that is beneficial for those microbes, so for the good microbes to grow. So it's like the microbes and the host are working together to create an environment to promote gut health. But when you do when there's antibiotic treatment, what we saw is that this beneficial relationships gets completely disrupted. And what we start to see is oxygen reaching the lumen, and there's production of other metabolites such as nitrate that those bad microbes, such Enterobacteriaceae, can come and use because they like to respire, so they can grow and outcompete the microbiota. And a quick story about this that is interesting is because I almost quit this project like halfway through because I was doing the experiments and the experiments weren't working. And then a friend of mine in the lab, there was a PhD student in the lab, he was like, don't give up, just keep doing it. Try some different time points, try some, like, tweak the experiment a little bit. And I was like, fine, I'll do it. And then following his advice, suddenly it was just a matter of changing the time point from like day 2 to day 4 in the experiment. And all the phenotypes started to show up. And then what I thought was a project that was not going to work became a science paper. So sometimes you just have to tweak things a little bit. So anyway, so what we thought is that maybe then this concept could be applicable to other diseases. So one of the things that we did in our lab, we thought that maybe this epithelial disruption that is happening in antibiotics could explain some of the dysbiosis that we see with obesity. And that is one of the projects in my lab. That, speaking another thing, my postdoc, Woon Jae, he actually came with me from Davis when I left. So he left the lab of established investigator and took a chance on a new assistant professor and came with me. And actually, this paper has just been accepted in Science with him as first author. So thanks to me, it worked out. I didn't disappoint him. But so like he took chances too, and it ended up paying off. So to answer this, we use a mouse model in which we feed the mice a high-fat diet to mimic a kind of McDonald's diet. And we see that these mice also have a bloom of Enterobacteriaceae in their gut. So that dysbiosis, that's imbalance in the microbiota happens in this model too, and that's the model that we use. So what we actually found in this story is similar to what we found in antibiotics, is that if you eat a healthy diet, the relationship between the microbiota and the epithelium is preserved, the cells are behaving the way that they should, and that's an environment that's beneficial for the for both the host and the microbes. But actually, when you eat a high-fat diet, what is happening here is that the diet itself is damaging the mitochondria in the intestinal epithelium and making the intestinal epithelium behave differently. And because of that, there's an inflammatory tone, and Enterobacteriaceae can grow and cause disease. And what was interesting is that obesity, in particular, is linked to a cardiovascular disease, which is before COVID was considered the epidemic of the 21st century, right? So we think that about 60% of the US population is going to be obese by 2030, which is kind of striking. And it turns out that the microbiota does play a role in this link between obesity and cardiovascular disease. And actually what we found is that when you eat a high-fat diet, there's this damage to the intestinal epithelium. This oxygen and nitrate become available in the gut for Enterobacteriaceae to use. And why is that bad? That is bad because these bacteria can actually metabolize components of your diet, of the bad diet, such as choline, that turns into TMA, which is TMA or trimethylamine. That is a compound that, once oxidized in the liver, increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. So what we're thinking here is that by eating a bad diet, there's a change in the environment in the gut lumen that turns on specific metabolic pathways in the bad microbes in the gut that will increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. That is like the whole thing in a nutshell. I didn't want to overwhelm anyone with data, but if anyone wants more data on how we got to this, I'm happy to show you more. So with that, I actually wanted to thank other people in my lab that have done the work, especially Woon, Jay, and Nar, two postdocs in my laboratory that worked in this, and my lab, and we are also very supportive of increasing diversity and inclusion in science. And I am part of some of the diversity and inclusion committees here at Vanderbilt. And so if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to answer. So that's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Mariana. What an inspirational story. That is incredibly helpful. I see a question here in the chat. What's been the most difficult or rewarding part about being an international scholar and being in a new country? That's a great question.
I think the most difficult, like honestly, is the US immigration system. I think you're like always in pins and needles, like not sure whether you're going to be welcome here or for how long you're going to be welcome here, or when things are going to change and you may have to. Your status may change. And for me, it was even harder once I had my family, because I had my son before I was an American citizen. So I wasn't I became an American citizen last year. So for a long time, my husband and my son were American citizens and I wasn't. So there were times we were traveling and anyway, and then we had to go to different lines. I think that was the hardest part, like not making sure that your future is really could happen here, not because of you not being good, but because of how the whole immigration system works. The most rewarding, I think, is to have a different view of the culture. Like, I think coming from a different country and seeing all the opportunities that you get in the US, I think you value that a lot more. And I think that it helps shape the way you mentor your students and the way you talk to with your students about what is happening, because you have just a different view. Like, I think you take things for granted less, I feel like. And sometimes you can take more advantage of the resources around you because you know what it is to not have any of those.
That's a great point. I've got a question. So vet school to this, did you ever consider did you like vet school at all? Or was that really just part of a path to doing this?
I really liked vet school, and I actually loved like treating the animals. And I tell that the reason why I didn't stay with the animals is because I had a hard time dealing with the owners. And I say that especially in Brazil, because a lot of people just didn't have the money to treat the animals. So like they'll come to the hospital and you wanted to help the animals, but the owner was like, I don't have the money. And then I was like, that can't be my job, because I'm gonna not make money because I'm gonna help other animals. That's how I ended up in veterinary pathology first, and I still love doing more diagnostic work, like trying to figure out what happened to the animals. And so I would still go back to that, but not the clinical part.
Mm. We got a couple of great questions in the chat. So you were an international candidate applying to grad schools here. How did you stand out being an international student applying here?
So I think the way that I was able to get into this graduate school is because I established a collaboration with the mentor before. So my PI from Brazil helped me establish a collaboration with the person in the US, to be able to get into her lab, instead of me just like randomly applying to a lab that I didn't know anyone. So I think that does help when you're international, if you kind of establish that connection before you even apply. And for the particular program, for me to be able to get accepted, I had to be accepted by a lab. So it wasn't like the IGP that you come in and then you choose a lab. For that particular program, you had to have like a professor tell you that you're going to be a part of their lab, and then you could come in. I don't know for other, but I didn't apply to any other ones because I didn't get funded for the Brazilian government side. At that time, I didn't really know that I could actually apply to multiple programs.
All right. What about, so you, your work is very translational. Do you, there's a question, do you do translational work? And I guess maybe what they're meaning is, do you use human samples in any of your work?
Yeah, so when I came to Vanderbilt, I did not, like, I'm pretty much a very much basic scientist. But since coming here, I'm starting some collaborations to eventually to start working with patient samples, especially for the obesity part, linking to early onset colorectal cancer. We're starting a collaboration. So the goal is in the future to do more human samples, but right now most of our work is with animal models of disease.
And here's a really good big picture question. So just to give you some context, the goal of this series is to help students applying who are debating and thinking about, do they want to do PhD, MD, PhD? Granted, that's still a very narrow view of the options, but broadly speaking, what advice would you give to someone who's really trying to assess their career goals and figure out what they want to do for the next step?
Oh man.
I know, it's a big one.
I think the most important thing is like think what makes you happy. Like, what do you feel like in 5-10 years, where would you want to be? And if you see yourself having a lab, or if you see yourself really wanting to interact with patients, and have more of the MD route, and try it out. I think, like, if you have I don't know, that's the best advice, but I tell my people, like, you have to volunteer and talk to MDs, talk to people that have followed different careers, so you can do a pro and cons of each one of them. I think another thing is like, make a list of what the good things about it and the bad things about it after talking to people that have gone that career path, and see which ones would be like a deal breaker for you versus something, oh, I could tolerate that. Like for me, doing necropsy or autopsies was a deal breaker for me at the time. So I was like, I would love to treat people, but I can't do this every day. So what else can I do? What career path I can still follow? that will make me help people, but that will be within my comfort zone, you know. Or I have a student in the lab, an undergrad that he wants to do MD, and I've been trying to convince her to do MD PhD, so we talk a lot. And she has some very valid points about what she wants. She's like, I don't know if I want to do an 8 years and make less money, or if I want to do something faster. And, you know, I think there's like things that only you can really decide on what your career is. But talk to people, ask questions, write down what you think are the good and the bad things, and see what is the best thing for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I did this, is kind of in lieu of talking to people.
Yeah.
To kind of hear the stories and see what clicks and see what doesn't click. But you're right, doing it is you might have an idea of what might feel good or not, but doing it is the best next step. So.
Yes, I think so too. Like in vet school, I hated cows. But I was in vet school, so I needed to do cows. So on the first thing that I did, I actually signed up for an internship, a summer internship working with cows. I was like, I think I hate cows, but I don't know. So let me try and do an internship to see, maybe I'll find something great about it, or maybe not. I found out like that wasn't for me, but I think I've had that experience, you know, like sometimes trying it out, even if it's for a little bit of time, or finding people that you can, yeah, I think like, because sometimes you have an idea of what something can be, but unless you try it, you're not really gonna know.
I'm with you. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everybody who's watching. It's good to see you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Bye.
Check out our website to find recordings of all of our videos. We'll get them posted about a week after each of the presentations. We can't wait to see you.